How tooty to hawk a long time ago. The creator was traveling from the east, and in his hands he carried many, many languages, and he was giving each group a beautiful language. Now, as he traveled, his face was shining so brightly that nobody could see him. He arrived at the Puget Sound country, the Lushootseed people, and he stopped and he looked around and he said, "This is the most beautiful country in my world. Now, I really don't have to go any further. I'm going to stop right here."
Grandma had a dream that someday everybody here would be speaking this language, and I think wouldn't that be wonderful if, Lushootseed became a very common language for the Puget Sound area. My name is Jill LaPointe, and it would be more appropriate for me to introduce myself the way I do in my culture, which is Siskolquash, Sista, Tul al Ched, Nooksack, Gol Skagit, Ibats Ched, Tsi Tu Takshablu. I'm the granddaughter of Takshablu Vai Hilbert, and I'm from Nooksack and Upper Skagit. I spent many summers and many, many hours with my grandmother growing up, and my grandmother, Takshablu, spoke Lushootseed and would tell me stories in the language and talk to me in the language and teach me words. And she had not spent her entire life speaking the language herself. So she, even though she grew up listening to her parents speak the language, she also had gone to a boarding school, so had not been encouraged in school to speak her language. But she did remember it. Lessons and teachings, they are found through our stories, and there's also many significant lessons that are embedded and sort of encoded within our language that get lost in English. And so if we lose our original language, then there will be many things from the culture that we will also lose with it. There's hundreds of languages around the world that are being lost every month, every day, and we're kind of right on the edge that if the language doesn't really get revived and activated, that it's possible that we could lose it, because there are not really people living today that grew up with Lushootseed as their first language. There were huge collections that had been gathered over the years by scholars that Grandma went and transcribed and translated, and then she documented them into some books. I think one of her biggest projects was a Lushootseed dictionary that came about with work from Tom Hess and another student, Don Bates. And it was the first time the language had been developed in a written form and put together in a dictionary. She was impressed with him because he could pronounce her name properly, and Grandma was fascinated with the written language that he had developed, and so that began sort of a second career for her in her life. She had done many things prior to that, not related to the language, but in 1967 is when her journey started. And she spent the rest of her life going around, and for many years she gathered recordings of elders, and she found the recordings that some other folks had taped of the elders speaking language and telling stories in the language. I told my grandmother that I was willing to, and that I wanted very much to make sure her work carried on. And so she, you know, handed over this nonprofit organization called Lushootseed Research that she had started in 1983. And when I took that on, and I've really been kind of finding my way in that role over the last couple of years, because, my grandmother was a trailblazer in many ways regarding preserving the language. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, who am I to try and take this on and carry this out, continue this work? And what could I do? In what way am I best able to facilitate this? I'm not a Lushootseed teacher. I've spent the last 20 years being a social worker doing Indian child welfare. But at the same time, when I was, going to the university and when I studied the language with my grandmother, and she had a class too here on the literature where we took each of the stories and we would write what our interpretation of the lessons from the stories were. And so throughout my career working with people in a counseling capacity and helping profession with the Native communities, I've really come to realize that a positive self-image and sense of being whole and having positive mental health and wellness comes from having a strong connection to our cultural ties about who we are and where we come from and the legacies that our ancestors have left for us. Grandma has a phrase that I'm really trying to embrace, which is Switulus uyayus, and it's work that the Creator is wrapping around me. And to me, the way I've interpreted that is each person has this calling in life, and that is what we sort of call that. This is what we're intended to do. This is our life's purpose. And when I was younger, I don't think necessarily that I understood that, but as I listen to that and I think about the teachings that have been passed on, is that every person has something that we're intended to do here. And when we recognize those gifts and we don't try to run from them, that recently has come up that Coyote tried to run away, and what do I do? And all of a sudden this rock started following him, and it's like we can't outrun what our life's calling is.
The sky was too low. The people talked, and the wise leaders said, "We can lift the sky." And some of the doubting Thomases said, "How can we lift the sky when we don't understand one another?" And the wise people said, "We could learn one word, Yahau. And with that one word, we can create anything possible."